Hi, this is Janice Switlo, continuing on with Cede 2.0. This is part 15 that begins on page 61. Chief Robert Louis practiced law and spearheaded the FNLMA. Quote, Chief Louis is also a former practicing lawyer who specialized in Native law, end of quote, Native Leaders of Canada. It is troublesome that he is not only not clear on the distinctions in federal law between control and administration, but that also he did not know how many signatories were in the FNLMA regime. Quote, Senator Buth, how many individual signatories are there to the First Nations land management regime? Mr. Louis, offhand, I believe there are between 57 and 60 signatories today. Proceedings of the Standing Senate Committee on National Finance, Issue 22, Evidence, June 13, 2012 afternoon meeting. Currently, they list 51 operational parties and 112 member communities on the FNLMA regime website, which is labrc.com. The schedule to the FNLMA currently shows 113 listed under First Nation that has signed the framework agreement and 32 listed as having land codes in force. Is anyone even talking about the same variable? I have no idea who is signed in or passed what in relation to the FNLMA. This is not a lot of information to manage. Why not be clear and consistent? I find the use of that term signatories interesting and significant given the pervasive use of the term by Indigenous nationals when they speak of their treaties, identifying their personal family history, for example, by reference to relatives who are treaty signatories. Canada describes only that, quote, more control, end of quote, is quote, allowed, end of quote, by the minister through the FNLMA, and is careful to link use of the word control to managed and current management by application of the Indian Act. Quote, about the program. The Indian Act controls how their reserve lands and resources are managed. This includes how their reserve lands are used or developed for personal, community, and economic development purposes. The First Nations land management regime gives First Nations more control over their reserve lands and resources by allowing them to opt out of the 34 sections of the Indian Act related to land management. Under the regime, First Nations develop their own laws to manage their reserve lands, including laws governing land designations, environmental protection, and matrimonial real property. First Nations in the regime are free to develop projects on reserve land without approval from the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. These First Nations can respond to new business opportunities more quickly and efficiently than those who reserve lands remain under the Indian Act, end of quote. This is also an admission that the federal government is not being as quick and efficient as it ought to be in fulfilling the Crown requirement under treaties to administer. There's only one section of the FNLMA that has the word control in it, limited to land use and development of the surrendered reserves in section 20, sub 2, sub A. 2. Without restricting the generality of subsection 1, First Nation laws may include laws respecting A, the regulation, control, or prohibition of land use and development, including zoning and subdivision control. This is consistent with Section 18.2 sub A of the Framework Agreement. Quote, the following examples illustrate some of the First Nation laws contemplated by the parties. A, laws on the regulation, control, and prohibition of zoning, land use, subdivision control, and land development. Nowhere to be found in the FNLMA regime. Robert Louis does, however, like the word, quote, Indigenous, end of quote, which he may or may not have mixed up with Ingenious, he is quoted, when he wants to sell his wine. Quote, it's a first for Canada, perhaps the world. The first winery to be completely owned and operated by a member of a First Nations is located just across the bridge in West Kelowna. It's called Indigenous, owned by Chief of the West Bank First Nation, Robert Louis, who has just bottled the first vintages. Indigenous World Winery, Inc. Quote, "We believe that with the heritage, the cultural background of the Indigenous peoples in the valley, that certainly is going to be part of the uniqueness." I'm not familiar with any Indigenous peoples. "The first wines under the Indigenous label will be available through private wine stores within a few weeks. Louis is currently building a tasting room and retail store on Highway 97 just north of the overpass." This is a report by Gord Vizuti, West Bank First Nation Chief Robert Louis, to release his own wine on am1150.ca, March 19, 2015.